Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into something absolutely wild. Ancient Egyptian junk food. Yes, you heard that right. Long before drive-thrus, vending machines, or convenience stores existed, the people along the Nile had their own version of guilty pleasure snacking. And trust me, some of it was surprisingly delicious, some of it was questionably dangerous, and all of it was uniquely Egyptian. So before we get started, take a moment to hit that like button if you're curious about what people were munching on 4,000 years ago, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what your favorite modern junk food is. I'm always fascinated to see how our snacking habits compare across time and geography. Now settle in, maybe grab your own snack, and let's journey back to ancient Egypt, where the art of indulgent eating was already alive and well. Picture this. You're living along the Nile River around 2000 BCE. The sun is blazing overhead. You've just finished a long day working in the fields or hauling stones for some pharaoh's latest construction project, and you're absolutely starving. But here's the thing, you're not reaching for an apple or some wholesome grain porridge. No, you want something that hits different, something sweet, crispy, or satisfying in that way that only treats can be. Welcome to the world of ancient Egyptian snacking, where indulgence met ingenuity long before anyone knew what a Twinkie was. The ancient Egyptians were surprisingly sophisticated when it came to their guilty pleasures. While most people think of their diet as consisting mainly of bread and beer, which it largely did, they also had an entire culture built around special occasion foods and everyday treats that would make your sweet tooth sing. Let's start with something that might blow your mind: honey cakes. These weren't your delicate, fluffy modern pastries. Ancient Egyptian honey cakes were dense, sticky, and built to last. Think of them as the original energy bars, except way more delicious and infinitely more likely to glue your teeth together. The process was fascinating. Bakers would mix flour with water or milk, then add generous amounts of honey. But here's where it gets interesting. This honey wasn't the refined, filtered stuff you buy at the grocery store. This was raw, unprocessed honey that came straight from the hive, complete with bits of wax and the occasional bee part. It was thick, golden, and packed with flavor that would make modern honey taste like sugar water. They'd shape these cakes into various forms, sometimes like birds or fish, because apparently even ancient bakers understood that presentation matters. The honey would caramelize during baking, creating a golden crust that was both beautiful and practically indestructible. Some of these cakes were so well preserved that archaeologists have found them in tombs, still recognizable after thousands of years. But honey cakes weren't just random treats. They held serious cultural significance. Honey was associated with the gods, particularly Ra, the sun god. Eating honey was considered a form of communion with the divine. So when you bit into one of these sticky delights, you weren't just satisfying your sweet tooth. You were participating in a sacred act. The texture was something else entirely. Imagine biting into something that starts crispy on the outside but gives way to a chewy, almost taffy-like interior. The honey would coat your mouth, delivering waves of sweetness that lingered long after you'd finished eating. For people whose regular diet consisted mainly of bread, vegetables, and the occasional piece of meat, these honey bombs were pure luxury. Now, let's talk about something that sounds exotic, but was actually incredibly common. Tiger nut sweets. Before you start wondering about endangered big cats, let me clear this up. Tiger nuts aren't nuts at all, and no tigers were involved in their production. They're actually small tubers that grow underground, kind of like tiny potatoes with a naturally sweet flavor. The ancient Egyptians discovered that these little nuggets were perfect for making portable snacks. They'd grind tiger nuts into a coarse flour, mix it with honey and sometimes dates, then shape the mixture into small balls or patties. The result was something that had the texture of a dense cookie but tasted like concentrated sweetness, with a nutty undertone. What made tiger nut sweets so popular was their practicality. They were incredibly nutritious, packed with fiber, healthy fats, and natural sugars. They could survive long journeys without spoiling, making them perfect for traders, workers, and anyone who needed sustained energy. Plus, they were naturally sweet, so they satisfied cravings without requiring additional sweeteners. The preparation process was almost meditative. Families would gather to grind the tiger nuts by hand, using stone mortars and pestles. The rhythmic pounding would fill homes with a nutty aroma, and children would hover around hoping to snatch bits of the mixture before it was formed into final treats. But here's what really made these special. Tiger nuts were believed to have medicinal properties. Ancient Egyptian medical texts mention them as treatments for digestive issues and as general health tonics. So when someone indulged in tiger nut sweets, they could justify it as being good for their health. Sound familiar? The texture was unique, somewhere between chewy and crunchy, with little bits that would get stuck in your teeth. But that was part of the experience. These weren't refined, uniform snacks. They were rustic, handmade treats that varied from batch to batch, each one slightly different in texture and sweetness. Moving on to something that might surprise you, the ancient Egyptians were absolutely obsessed with dates. Not the romantic kind, though I'm sure they had those too. I'm talking about the fruit. These wrinkled, intensely sweet morsels were like candy to the ancient world, and Egyptians found countless ways to turn them into indulgent treats. Date balls were probably the most popular form. Imagine taking fresh dates, removing the pits, then mashing them into a paste. Sometimes they'd add chopped nuts, sometimes honey, sometimes spices like cinnamon or cardamom that had been traded from distant lands. Then they'd roll this mixture into bite-sized balls and let them dry slightly. The result was intensely sweet, almost overwhelmingly so by modern standards. One date ball could deliver enough sugar to make your head spin, but in a world without refined sugar, this natural sweetness was precious. Workers building pyramids received date rations as part of their payment, and these treats were considered valuable enough to include in tomb provisions for the afterlife. But dates weren't just eaten plain. Egyptian cooks discovered they could be turned into syrups by boiling them down with water until they formed a thick, molasses-like consistency. This date syrup was then drizzled over bread, mixed into other desserts, or eaten straight from the spoon by those brave enough to handle the sugar rush. The stickiness was legendary. Date syrup had the consistency of tree sap and would cling to everything it touched. Eating date-based treats was a messy affair that required careful planning and probably a good wash afterward. But nobody cared because the flavour was incredible, rich and complex, with notes of caramel and brown sugar that hadn't even been invented yet. Some enterprising cooks would stuff dates with nuts or other fruits, creating little flavour bombs that combined different textures and tastes. Others would press dates into flat sheets, cut them into shapes, and dry them into something resembling fruit leather. The creativity was endless, limited only by available ingredients and imagination. Now here's where things get really interesting. The ancient Egyptians figured out fermentation long before anyone understood the science behind it. And they applied this knowledge to create something that was part snack, part beverage, and entirely addictive. Fermented fruit pastes. They'd take overripe fruits, particularly dates and figs, mash them into pulps, and allow natural fermentation to occur. The wild yeasts in the air would begin working on the fruit sugars, creating alcohol and developing complex flavors. The result was a thick paste-like substance that was mildly alcoholic and intensely flavorful. These fermented pastes were eaten by the spoonful or spread on bread. They had a tangy, slightly sour taste that balanced the natural sweetness of the fruit. The alcohol content was low enough that they were considered safe for daily consumption, but high enough to provide a mild buzz, especially if you ate enough of them. The fermentation process also had the added benefit of preservation. In a hot climate without refrigeration, fermented foods lasted much longer than fresh ones. So these pastes served a practical purpose while also satisfying the desire for something special and flavorful. What's fascinating is how sophisticated their understanding of fermentation had become. Different fruits required different techniques, and Egyptian cooks had figured out how to control the process to achieve consistent results. They knew which fruits fermented best together, how temperature affected the outcome, and how long to let the process continue for optimal flavor. The social aspect of these treats was just as important as their taste. Sharing fermented fruit paste was a sign of hospitality and friendship. Offering someone a taste of your family's special recipe was a gesture of trust and inclusion. These weren't just snacks, they were social currency in a world where food was often scarce and precious. But let's dive into something that might sound familiar, but was executed in ways that would shock modern palates. Fried dough. Yes, the ancient Egyptians were deep frying things thousands of years before funnel cakes became a carnival staple. But their version was both simpler and more intense than anything you'd find at a modern food truck. The process started with basic bread dough, but instead of baking it, they'd heat up clay pots filled with oil or animal fat until it was smoking hot. Then they'd drop small pieces of dough into this bubbling cauldron and watch them puff up into golden, crispy orbs. The oil they used wasn't the refined vegetable oil we know today. This was often sesame oil or rendered animal fat that had been used and reused until it developed its own complex, slightly funky flavor profile. What made these fried treats special was the contrast. The outside would become incredibly crispy, almost shell-like, while the inside remained soft and chewy. But here's the kicker. They'd immediately drizzle these hot fritters with honey. While they were still crackling from the oil, the honey would hit the hot surface and create this incredible sizzling sound as it caramelized instantly. The temperature combination was dangerous. The oil-soaked dough was scorching hot, the honey was room temperature, and your mouth was about to experience both extremes simultaneously. People would dance around blowing on their fingers and fanning their mouths, but they couldn't stop eating them because the flavor was absolutely incredible. These weren't delicate pastries. They were rustic, almost aggressive in their intensity. The oil would make your lips shine, the honey would stick to your teeth, and the combination of textures would keep your jaw working long after you thought you were finished. Some batches came out perfectly golden and crispy. Others were slightly burnt or unevenly cooked, but that was part of the charm. Each piece was a unique experience. Street vendors would set up their frying operations near temples and markets, sending clouds of aromatic smoke into the air that could be smelled from blocks away. The sound of sizzling oil and the sight of golden orbs bubbling in clay pots drew crowds like ancient food trucks. Workers would line up during their breaks, coins ready, mouths already watering in anticipation. Now, speaking of textures that would challenge modern sensibilities, let's talk about something the Egyptians considered a delicacy: dried fish jerky, but not the kind you might imagine. This wasn't carefully seasoned and uniformly dried meat. This was whole small fish, gutted and cleaned, then left to dry in the desert sun until they resembled leather strips with eyes. The preparation was straightforward, but required perfect timing. Fresh fish from the Nile would be split open, salted with precious salt from desert deposits, then laid out on reed mats under the blazing sun. After several days, they'd transform into these dark, incredibly tough strips that could survive months without spoiling. The salt drew out all the moisture while concentrating the fish flavors into something intensely savory. Eating dried fish jerky was an exercise in determination. You couldn't just bite into it casually. It required serious jaw strength and patience. People would gnaw on pieces for minutes, slowly breaking down the tough fibers while their saliva rehydrated the meat. The flavor was overwhelmingly salty and fishy, with undertones that spoke of the Nile itself. But here's what made it addictive. Once you got past the initial shock of texture and saltiness, the fish would start releasing complex flavors. There were notes of the river, hints of the salt deposits, and the concentrated essence of whatever the fish had been eating. It was like chewing on the entire ecosystem of ancient Egypt. Children grew up gnawing on fish jerky the way modern kids might chew gum. It kept their jaws busy, provided protein and salt that their bodies craved, and was portable enough to carry anywhere. Workers would tuck pieces into their clothing for long days of labor, pulling them out whenever they needed a burst of energy and flavor. The social aspect was important too. Sharing good fish jerky was a sign of friendship. If someone offered you a piece from their personal stash, it meant they considered you worthy of their best preserved fish. The quality varied dramatically depending on the skill of the person who prepared it and the conditions during drying. Let's shift gears to something that occupied a special place in Egyptian snacking culture: roasted seeds. But we're not talking about neat little packages of sunflower seeds. The ancient Egyptians roasted whatever seeds they could find, and some of their favorites would surprise you. Lotus seeds were particularly prized, though getting them required wading into marshy areas where the lotus plants grew. The lotus flower held deep religious significance in Egyptian culture, symbolizing rebirth and the sun. But beyond the symbolism, the seeds were genuinely delicious when properly prepared. They'd harvest the seed pods when they were just right, not too young and soft, not too old and hard. Then came the roasting process, which was more art than science. Clay pots would be heated over fires until they were incredibly hot. Then handfuls of seeds would be tossed in, constantly stirred with wooden paddles to prevent burning. The seeds would pop and crack as they roasted, filling the air with a nutty aroma that was absolutely intoxicating. The timing was crucial, because the line between perfectly roasted and burnt was razor thin. When done right, roasted lotus seeds had a texture somewhere between popcorn and nuts. They were crunchy on the outside, but had a slightly soft interior that released a sweet, nutty flavor. The taste was mild but satisfying, with just enough substance to feel like you were eating something meaningful rather than just empty calories. But lotus seeds weren't the only option. Egyptians also roasted watermelon seeds, which were smaller but packed with flavor. These tiny seeds would become incredibly crunchy and had a concentrated taste that was almost buttery. Melon seeds required even more careful attention during roasting because their size made them prone to burning quickly. The social ritual around roasted seeds was important. Families would gather in the evenings, sitting in circles while someone tended the roasting pot. Children would hover nearby, waiting for the first batch to cool enough to eat. The sound of cracking shells and gentle conversation created a peaceful atmosphere that contrasted with the harsh realities of daily life. These seeds were also practical nutrition. In a diet that was often lacking in fats and proteins, roasted seeds provided essential nutrients in a form that was both enjoyable and long-lasting. They could be stored for weeks without spoiling, and were perfect for taking on journeys or saving for times when other food was scarce. Here's something that might sound absolutely wild to modern ears. The ancient Egyptians made something that was essentially ancient granola, but their version included ingredients that would make health food enthusiasts today either fascinated or horrified. They called it mixed grain cakes, and the preparation was both simple and ingenious. The base was various grains that had been toasted until they developed deep, nutty flavors. Barley, emmer wheat, and sometimes even wild grasses would be carefully heated in clay pots until they turned golden brown and released aromatic oils. This toasting process was crucial because it not only developed flavor, but also made the grains easier to digest. Once the grains were perfectly toasted, they'd be mixed with honey, dates that had been chopped into small pieces, and whatever nuts or seeds were available. Sometimes they'd add dried fruits that had been traded from other regions, creating combinations that were both exotic and familiar. The mixture would be pressed into flat cakes and allowed to dry until they held together, but still had some give when bitten. The texture was incredible, crunchy and chewy at the same time, with different elements revealing themselves as you ate. You'd bite into a piece and encounter the nuttiness of toasted grain, the sweetness of honey, the chewiness of dates, and the crunch of seeds all in one mouthful. It was like eating a compressed version of an entire harvest. These grain cakes were serious nutrition. They provided complex carbohydrates, natural sugars, healthy fats, and proteins, all in one compact package. Workers could carry a few pieces and have enough energy to sustain them through long days of physical labor. The combination of ingredients meant they digested slowly, providing steady energy rather than quick sugar spikes. But beyond their practical benefits, these cakes represented something deeper. They were a celebration of abundance, a way of taking the basic ingredients of survival and transforming them into something that brought joy. In a world where food security was never guaranteed, creating something this indulgent from simple grains was an act of optimism and creativity. The preparation process brought communities together. Families would coordinate their toasting and mixing, sharing ingredients and techniques. The elderly would pass down knowledge about which grain combinations worked best, how to achieve the perfect level of toasting, and how to bind everything together without making it too dense or too crumbly. Now let's explore something that shows just how sophisticated Egyptian food culture had become. Spiced nut brittle. This wasn't just nuts held together with honey. This was a complex confection that required timing, temperature control, and an understanding of how different ingredients behaved when heated together. The process began with collecting the best nuts available. Almonds were prized when they could be obtained through trade, but more commonly, they used indigenous nuts and seeds. These would be carefully inspected, with any damaged or rancid pieces removed, because one bad nut could ruin an entire batch of brittle. The honey was heated in special clay pots designed for candy making. This wasn't a casual process. The honey had to reach exactly the right temperature, hot enough to become hard when cooled, but not so hot that it burned and became bitter. Egyptian candy makers developed techniques for testing the honey's readiness, dropping small amounts into cool water to see how they behaved. Once the honey reached the proper temperature, the nuts would be stirred in quickly, followed by spices that had been ground to fine powders. Cinnamon, when available, was the most prized addition, but they also used local aromatic plants and imported spices that arrived via trade routes. The mixture had to be stirred constantly to prevent burning and ensure even distribution. Then came the critical moment. The hot mixture would be poured onto flat stone surfaces that had been oiled to prevent sticking. Working quickly before it hardened, the candy makers would spread it thin and score it into pieces. The timing was everything because the mixture went from workable to rock hard in just minutes. The finished brittle was unlike anything we might recognize today. It was intensely sweet from the concentrated honey, but the spices added layers of complexity that kept it from being one-dimensional. The nuts provided texture and richness, while the spices created warmth and depth. Each piece was a small explosion of flavors that lingered long after eating. The brittle wasn't just eaten as a sweet treat either. It became a status symbol, something wealthy families would serve to guests to demonstrate their access to rare ingredients and skilled preparation techniques. Breaking off pieces of spiced brittle and sharing them was a ritual of hospitality, a way of saying that your visitors were worth your most precious resources. But here's where Egyptian snacking gets really fascinating. They developed something that was essentially ancient popcorn, but made from grains you've probably never heard of. Using emmer wheat and barley, they discovered that if you heated these grains in clay pots with just the right amount of oil, some of them would actually pop and expand, creating light, crunchy morsels that were completely different from the dense bread they usually made from the same ingredients. The technique required incredible skill and patience. The grains had to be heated slowly and evenly, stirred constantly to prevent burning. Only a certain percentage would actually pop, and knowing when to stop the process before everything turned to charcoal was an art form passed down through generations. The successfully popped grains would be mixed with salt from the desert deposits, or drizzled with honey for a sweet version. This popped grain snack was revolutionary because it transformed heavy, filling ingredients into something light and airy. Workers could munch on handfuls without feeling overly full, making it perfect for sustained energy during long days. The texture was completely unique in their food culture, providing a satisfying crunch that was different from nuts or dried foods. Children absolutely loved these popped grains, and parents discovered they could use them as both treats and bribes. The sound of grains popping in clay pots became associated with special occasions and celebrations. Families would gather around the cooking fire, listening for the telltale popping sounds that meant a successful batch was developing. Now let's talk about something that sounds almost impossible but was actually quite common. Ancient Egyptian ice cream. Well, not ice cream exactly, but they figured out how to create frozen treats using a combination of snow from distant mountains, underground storage, and some seriously clever engineering. During the rare times when snow could be transported from mountainous regions, wealthy Egyptians would pack it in deep underground chambers lined with straw and other insulating materials. They discovered that if they mixed this precious snow with fruit juices, honey, and crushed nuts, they could create something remarkably similar to what we'd recognize as sorbet. The logistics were incredible. Teams of runners would transport snow in specially designed containers, racing against time and the desert heat. The snow that survived the journey was more valuable than gold, reserved for the pharaoh's table and the wealthiest nobles. But when it was available, Egyptian cooks pushed the boundaries of what was possible. They'd layer the snow with fruit purees made from dates, figs, and whatever exotic fruits they could obtain through trade. Honey was drizzled throughout to add sweetness and help bind the mixture together. Crushed nuts and seeds provided texture, while aromatic herbs added complexity that made each spoonful a surprise. The serving was ceremonial. Frozen treats were presented in specially crafted bowls, often made from precious metals or decorated ceramics. Guests would be handed small spoons made from ivory or polished wood, and everyone understood they were participating in something extraordinary. The contrast between the frozen treat and the blazing desert heat made every bite feel miraculous. But most Egyptians never tasted these frozen luxuries. For them, the closest thing to a cooling treat was something far more accessible but equally ingenious. They created what could only be described as ancient popsicles using fruit juices and honey frozen in the coolest parts of their homes during winter nights. Clay molds would be filled with concentrated fruit juices mixed with honey and left outside during the coldest part of winter nights. In the brief hours before dawn, when desert temperatures occasionally dropped below freezing, these mixtures would partially freeze, creating slushy, semi-solid treats that provided blessed relief from the heat. These makeshift frozen treats were far from perfect. They were often more slush than solid, and the freezing was inconsistent. But for people living in one of the world's hottest climates, even a partially frozen fruit mixture felt like a gift from the gods. Children would wake up early, hoping to catch these treats before they melted completely in the morning sun. Moving on to something that required no special equipment but plenty of creativity, ancient Egyptians became masters of fruit leather. But their version was far more complex than just dried fruit. They created layered compositions that told stories through flavor, combining different fruits and spices to create edible narratives. The process began with selecting fruits at different stages of ripeness. Some needed to be perfectly ripe for maximum sweetness, while others were chosen slightly underripe for tartness and better structure. Dates, figs, grapes, and melons were common choices, but Egyptian fruit leather makers would experiment with whatever was available seasonally. Each fruit was processed differently. Dates were mashed into smooth pastes, figs were chopped to retain some texture, grapes were crushed and strained to remove seeds. These different preparations were then layered on reed mats, creating compositions that revealed different flavors as you worked through each layer. Spices played a crucial role in these creations. Cinnamon, when available, added warmth and complexity. Local aromatic plants provided unique flavors that we can't even imagine today. Some recipes included flower petals for fragrance, creating fruit leathers that were as much about aroma as taste. The drying process took days or even weeks, depending on the thickness and the weather. The fruit mixtures had to be turned regularly, protected from insects, and monitored constantly to ensure even drying. The finished product was flexible but substantial, with concentrated flavors that were intensely satisfying. But here's what made Egyptian fruit leather special. They understood layering not just physically, but temporally. Some ingredients were designed to hit your taste buds immediately, while others revealed themselves slowly as you chewed. The experience of eating a piece of well-made fruit leather was like listening to a symphony, with different notes emerging and fading in a carefully orchestrated sequence. Let's explore something that might sound familiar, but was executed in ways that would surprise modern snackers: ancient Egyptian trail mix. But this wasn't the neat combination of nuts, dried fruit, and maybe some chocolate pieces that we know today. This was survival food disguised as indulgence, packed with ingredients chosen for their ability to sustain life in harsh conditions. The base was always roasted grains, usually barley or emmer wheat, that had been carefully toasted to develop nutty flavors and improve digestibility. These provided the bulk and the sustained energy that travelers and workers needed. But the real artistry came in the additions, carefully chosen combinations that balanced nutrition, flavor, and storage life. Dried dates were chopped into small pieces, providing quick energy and sweetness. But Egyptian trail mix makers discovered that dates could be processed in different ways to create variety within a single mixture. Some dates were dried until they were almost leather-like. Others were partially dried to retain chewiness, and some were ground into powders that would coat other ingredients. Nuts and seeds were selected for their specific properties. Some provided oils and fats necessary for health, others offered protein, and some were chosen purely for their flavor and texture. The combinations were regional secrets, passed down through families and refined over generations of trial and error. But here's where it gets really interesting. Egyptian trail mix included ingredients that modern food scientists are just beginning to understand. Certain seeds and nuts were chosen not just for nutrition, but for their medicinal properties. Some aided digestion, others provided energy boosts, and some were believed to protect against illness during long journeys. The preparation was a community event. Families would pool their resources and knowledge, creating large batches that would be divided among all participants. The roasting, chopping, and mixing required many hands, and the process became a social gathering where stories were shared and techniques were passed down. Each batch was unique, reflecting the ingredients available, the skills of the makers, and the intended use. Trail mix meant for short journeys was different from mixtures designed to sustain people through weeks of travel. Some versions were optimized for quick energy, others for sustained nutrition over long periods. Now here's something that demonstrates the sophisticated understanding ancient Egyptians had of food chemistry. Fermented grain porridge that had been allowed to develop complex flavors and textures through controlled bacterial action. This wasn't just letting food spoil. This was managing fermentation to create something entirely new and surprisingly delicious. The process began with cooked grains, usually a mixture of barley and emmer wheat, that were allowed to cool to specific temperatures. Wild yeasts and bacteria from the environment would begin working on the grain starches, converting them into acids and alcohols that created complex flavors while also preserving the food. Egyptian fermentation masters understood timing in ways that seem almost magical. They knew exactly how long to let the process continue for different flavor profiles. Short fermentation created mildly tangy porridges with subtle complexity. Longer fermentation developed intense, almost cheese-like flavors that were incredibly satisfying, but required acquired tastes. The texture transformations were remarkable. What started as ordinary grain porridge would develop creamy consistencies, sometimes with small bubbles from fermentation gases. Some batches became almost fizzy, providing a unique sensation that was both food and drink simultaneously. These fermented porridges became the base for other creations. Honey could be stirred in to balance the acidity, nuts could be added for texture, or dried fruits could provide sweetness and additional complexity. The fermented base enhanced whatever was added to it, creating combinations that were far more than the sum of their parts. But the real genius was in preservation. Properly fermented grain porridge could last for weeks without spoiling, making it invaluable for long journeys or times when fresh food was scarce. The fermentation process actually made the nutrients more available for digestion while creating an environment hostile to harmful bacteria. Speaking of preservation, let's dive into something that showcases Egyptian ingenuity at its finest. Concentrated fruit syrups that were so dense with sugar and flavor that they could last for months while providing intense bursts of energy and taste. These weren't just sweeteners, they were flavor concentrates that could transform simple foods into complex experiences. The creation process was labor-intensive and required perfect timing. Fresh fruits would be crushed and the juices extracted through pressing or straining. These juices were then heated slowly in clay pots, with constant stirring to prevent burning. As the water evaporated, the natural sugars concentrated, creating increasingly thick syrups. The skill lay in knowing when to stop the reduction process. Too little cooking and the syrup wouldn't keep properly. Too much and it would become bitter or even burn. Master syrup makers developed techniques for testing consistency, often using the behavior of drops falling from wooden spoons as their guide. Different fruits required different approaches. Date syrup was made from fresh dates that were boiled and strained, creating a molasses-like consistency with incredible depth of flavor. Fig syrup retained more of the fruit's texture, with tiny seeds providing interesting contrasts. Grape syrup, when grapes were available, created something remarkably similar to what we might recognize as a primitive balsamic reduction. These concentrated syrups were used in ways that might surprise you. A small spoonful could transform plain bread into a dessert. Mixed with water, they became instant fruit drinks. Stirred into grain porridge, they created breakfast treats that provided sustained energy for physical labor. But the real magic happened when different syrups were combined. Egyptian syrup makers developed signature blends, mixing date and fig syrups with aromatic herbs or spices to create unique flavor profiles. These combinations were closely guarded secrets, passed down through families, and sometimes used as trade goods with other communities. The storage and serving of these syrups became ritualistic. Special clay jars were designed specifically for syrup storage, with narrow necks to minimize air exposure and tight-fitting lids to prevent contamination. When syrups were served to guests, it was a sign of serious hospitality, demonstrating both wealth and generosity. Children, of course, were obsessed with these concentrated sweeteners. Parents learned to hide their syrup stores carefully, knowing that unsupervised access could result in sticky disasters and sugar-fueled chaos. But small tastes of syrup were often used as rewards for good behavior or comfort during illness. What's remarkable about all these ancient Egyptian treats is how they reveal a sophisticated understanding of food science, nutrition, and flavor combination that we're only now beginning to fully appreciate. These weren't primitive people making do with limited ingredients. These were skilled food artisans creating complex, satisfying treats that served multiple purposes in their daily lives. From honey cakes that connected them to their gods, to fermented grain porridges that sustained them through difficult times, every snack served a purpose beyond simple pleasure. They were expressions of creativity, demonstrations of skill, celebrations of abundance, and practical solutions to the challenges of life in an unforgiving climate. But perhaps most importantly, these treats were social glue, bringing families and communities together around the shared experience of creating and enjoying food that went beyond mere survival. In a world where every calorie mattered and every ingredient was precious, the decision to create something purely for enjoyment was an act of hope and humanity. The legacy of these ancient Egyptian junk foods lives on in ways we might not even recognize. Many of the techniques they developed for concentrating flavors, preserving foods, and combining ingredients laid the groundwork for culinary traditions that spread throughout the ancient world and eventually influenced the treats we enjoy today. These ancient snack masters weren't content to stop at simple treats. They pushed boundaries in ways that would make modern food scientists take notes, take their approach to what we might call ancient protein bars. But forget everything you know about those chalky, artificial rectangles wrapped in shiny packaging. Egyptian protein bars were dense, chewy monuments to nutritional engineering that happened to taste incredible. The foundation was ground legumes, primarily lentils and chickpeas that had been dried and pulverized into fine powders. But here's where it gets fascinating. They discovered that if you mix these protein-rich powders with specific ratios of honey and ground seeds, you could create something that held together perfectly while delivering sustained energy that lasted for hours. The texture was unlike anything in their regular diet, dense enough to be substantial, chewy enough to keep your jaw occupied, but never so tough that it became a chore to eat. Each bite released layers of flavor as your saliva broke down the compressed ingredients. The legume base provided an earthy foundation, while honey added sweetness that developed and changed as you chewed. But Egyptian protein bar makers weren't satisfied with basic nutrition. They began experimenting with flavor additions that transformed these practical foods into genuine treats. Crushed coriander seeds added bright, citrusy notes. Fennel provided a subtle licorice undertone that complemented the earthiness beautifully. When available, imported black pepper created a gentle heat that lingered pleasantly. The preparation required serious skill. The ingredients had to be mixed in precise proportions, with just enough honey to bind everything without making the bars too sticky to handle. The mixture was then pressed into wooden molds and left to firm up in cool, dry places. The timing was critical because underpressed bars would crumble apart, while overpressed ones became rock hard. What made these bars revolutionary was their shelf life. Properly made, protein bars could last for months without spoiling, making them invaluable for long journeys, seasonal work, or storing against uncertain times. Workers building monuments would carry several bars, knowing they represented complete nutrition that wouldn't let them down when physical demands were highest. The social status of these bars was interesting too. While the basic legume and honey version was accessible to most people, wealthy families would commission special varieties that included expensive imported nuts, rare spices, or even small amounts of precious aromatic resins. These luxury versions became gifts worthy of important occasions. Now let's dive into something that showcases Egyptian creativity at its most playful. Flavored seed crackers that were essentially ancient chips, but with complexity that would shame most modern snack foods. These weren't simple baked goods. They were carefully engineered flavor delivery systems that provided crunch, satisfaction, and genuine nutritional value. The base was ground seeds from whatever plants were seasonally available. Sesame seeds were prized for their rich, nutty flavor and high oil content. Watermelon seeds, carefully collected and cleaned, provided a milder taste and interesting texture. Sunflower seeds, when available, added their distinctive earthy flavor and substantial crunch. But the real artistry came in the seasoning. Egyptian cracker makers discovered that different seed combinations responded to different flavor treatments. Some batches were seasoned with salt from desert deposits, creating intensely savory crackers that made your mouth water. Others were dusted with ground aromatic herbs that added complexity without overwhelming the natural seed flavors. The preparation process was almost meditative. Seeds had to be ground to exactly the right consistency, fine enough to hold together when moistened, but coarse enough to maintain interesting texture. Water was added gradually, just enough to form a workable dough that could be rolled thin without falling apart. These crackers were baked on flat stones that had been heated in fires until they reached perfect temperatures. The baking required constant attention because the thin crackers could go from perfectly crispy to burnt in moments. Successful batches emerged golden brown, with surfaces that had developed complex flavors through careful browning. The finished crackers were revelations of texture and taste. Each one was slightly different, with variations in thickness, browning, and seed distribution that made eating them an adventure. Some pieces were perfectly crispy throughout, others had slightly chewy centers that provided textural contrast. The seed flavors were concentrated and nutty, enhanced by the baking process. But here's what made these crackers special beyond their taste. They represented portable nutrition that could be eaten with one hand while working. Farmers could munch on them while tending crops, artisans could snack while crafting, and travelers could satisfy hunger without stopping their journeys. They were the original grab-and-go snack food. Children developed games around these crackers, seeing who could make theirs last longest, or trying to identify different seed varieties by taste alone. Parents appreciated that the crackers provided genuine nutrition while satisfying the desire for something crunchy and flavorful. Moving on to something that demonstrates the sophisticated palate ancient Egyptians had developed. Spiced vegetable chips made from roots and tubers that had been sliced thin and carefully dried with aromatic seasonings. This wasn't just preservation for survival. This was gourmet snack creation that happened to extend food storage life. The vegetables they used would surprise modern snackers. Lotus roots, when available from marshy areas, were prized for their unique appearance and mild flavor. When sliced crosswise, they revealed intricate patterns of holes that made each chip visually interesting. The texture was crisp but not brittle, with a subtle sweetness that paired beautifully with savory seasonings. Turnips and radishes were more commonly available and provided different flavor profiles. Turnips created chips with earthy, slightly bitter notes that were enhanced by careful seasoning. Radishes offered a natural peppery bite that made the chips almost addictive once you developed a taste for them. The slicing technique was crucial. Vegetables had to be cut uniformly thin, but not so thin that they became fragile during drying. Egyptian chip makers developed specialized cutting tools and techniques that allowed them to create consistent results, batch after batch. The drying process was where the real magic happened. Instead of simple sun-drying, these vegetables were treated with salt and spice mixtures before being laid out on reed mats. The salt drew out moisture while the spices penetrated the vegetable tissues, creating chips that were seasoned throughout rather than just on the surface. Different vegetables required different spice treatments. Lotus root chips were often seasoned with mild herbs that complemented their subtle sweetness. Turnip chips could handle stronger seasonings like ground coriander or fennel seeds. Radish chips were sometimes left unseasoned, allowing their natural heat to provide all the flavor complexity needed. The finished chips were stored in sealed clay containers to maintain their crispness. When properly prepared and stored, they could last for months without losing their crunch or flavor. Opening a container of well-made vegetable chips released aromas that could make your mouth water instantly. These chips became currency in their own right. High-quality batches were traded between families, given as gifts, or saved for special occasions. The skill required to make consistently good chips meant that successful chip makers gained reputations that extended beyond their immediate communities. But let's explore something that shows just how far Egyptian snack innovation had progressed. Layered nut and fruit bars that were essentially ancient energy bars, but with complexity that put modern versions to shame. These weren't simply mixed ingredients pressed together. They were carefully constructed flavor experiences that revealed different tastes and textures as you worked through each layer. The construction process was architectural. Different ingredients were prepared separately, each optimized for its specific role in the final product. Nuts were roasted to different degrees, depending on their position in the bar. Nuts that would be in the center were roasted lightly to maintain some softness, while surface nuts were roasted darker for crunch and intense flavor. Dried fruits received similar careful treatment. Dates intended for binding layers were mashed smooth, while decorative fruits were chopped to maintain visual appeal and textural interest. Some fruits were rehydrated slightly to make them more pliable. Others were left fully dried for concentrated flavor bursts. The layering sequence was critical. Base layers provided structure and sustained energy, typically made from ground nuts mixed with honey and pressed firmly. Middle layers added sweetness and variety, often featuring different fruit combinations that complemented each other. Top layers were designed for immediate impact, with visually appealing arrangements and intense flavors. Each layer had to bond properly with the ones above and below it, requiring precise moisture content and timing. Too dry and the layers would separate when cut. Too moist and the bars would become soggy and lose their structural integrity. Master bar makers developed techniques for achieving perfect adhesion while maintaining distinct layer identities. The finished bars were works of art that happened to be edible. When cut, they revealed striped cross-sections that showcased the maker's skill and attention to detail. Each bite delivered the planned sequence of flavors and textures, creating eating experiences that were both satisfying and memorable. These layered bars became gifts worthy of royalty. The time, skill, and expensive ingredients required to make them properly meant they represented serious investment and respect. Receiving a well-made layered bar was recognition of your importance to the giver. Now here's something that might sound impossible, but was actually quite common among wealthy Egyptian families. Candied flowers that transformed delicate blossoms into preserved treats that could last for months, while retaining their beauty and developing complex flavors. This wasn't just decoration. These were genuine confections that provided unique tastes impossible to achieve any other way. The process began with selecting flowers at exactly the right stage of development. Too young and they lacked the oils and compounds that would survive the preservation process. Too mature and they would fall apart during handling. Egyptian candy makers became experts at timing flower harvests to capture peak flavor and structural integrity. Rose petals were among the most prized, but the roses of ancient Egypt were different from modern varieties. They had more intense fragrances and flavors, with natural oils that concentrated beautifully during the candying process. Jasmine flowers provided different characteristics, with subtle sweetness and intoxicating aromas that made the finished candies almost intoxicating. The candying technique was surprisingly sophisticated. Fresh flowers were first treated with salt solutions that drew out excess moisture without damaging the delicate structures. Then they were gradually introduced to increasingly concentrated honey solutions, allowing the natural sugars to penetrate the flower tissues slowly and completely. The timing for each stage was critical. Rush the process and the flowers would collapse or develop off flavors. Take too long and natural decay would begin before preservation was complete. Successful flower candying required constant attention and years of experience to master. The finished candied flowers were small miracles of preservation. They maintained much of their original appearance while developing concentrated flavors that were entirely new. Rose petal candies delivered intense floral notes, followed by honey sweetness. Jasmine flowers provided subtle, complex tastes that seemed to change as you chewed them. These candied flowers weren't eaten casually. They were served at the most important occasions, presented on precious plates, and consumed with ceremony appropriate to their rarity and cost. A single candied flower could represent hours of skilled labor and expensive ingredients. The medicinal aspects were important too. Many flowers were believed to have healing properties that were concentrated and preserved through the candying process. Rose petals were thought to aid digestion and calm emotions. Jasmine was believed to promote mental clarity and peaceful sleep. Let's talk about something that demonstrates the playful side of Egyptian snack culture: shaped honey cookies that were molded into intricate forms representing everything from sacred animals to hieroglyphic symbols. These weren't just treats. They were edible art that told stories, conveyed messages, and celebrated important aspects of Egyptian culture. The cookie dough was based on ground grains mixed with honey and oils, but the consistency had to be perfect for molding. Too soft and the shapes would lose definition. Too stiff and the dough wouldn't pick up fine details from the carved molds. Egyptian cookie makers developed techniques for achieving exactly the right texture for different types of shapes. The molds themselves were works of art carved from wood or shaped from clay. Simple molds created basic animal shapes that children loved. Complex molds produced cookies with intricate details that showcased the maker's artistic skills and the importance of the occasion they were created for. Different shapes required different baking techniques. Thin, delicate cookies needed gentle heat and careful timing to avoid burning. Thicker, more substantial shapes could handle higher temperatures and longer baking times that developed deeper flavors through browning. The honey used in these cookies was often flavored with additional ingredients that enhanced the symbolic meaning of the shapes. Cookies shaped like sacred beetles might include spices associated with protection. Flower-shaped cookies could incorporate actual flower essences that reinforce their visual symbolism. Children were fascinated by these shaped cookies, using them as toys before eventually eating them. Parents appreciated that the cookies provided entertainment value beyond their nutritional content. The act of eating a cookie shaped like a sacred animal was believed to confer some of that animal's positive qualities. Special occasions called for elaborate cookie presentations. Religious festivals might feature cookies shaped like gods or sacred symbols. Harvest celebrations included cookies representing the bounty of successful crops. Wedding festivities showcased cookies that told stories of love and prosperity. The social aspects of shaped cookie making brought communities together around shared artistic endeavors. Families would gather to press dough into molds, sharing techniques and competing good-naturedly to create the most detailed and attractive results. But here's where Egyptian snack innovation reached almost modern levels of sophistication. Filled pastries that enclosed sweet or savory mixtures within carefully constructed dough shells. These weren't simple pockets of dough with random fillings. They were engineered food delivery systems designed to protect and enhance specific flavor combinations. The pastry dough required different characteristics than bread dough. It needed to be strong enough to contain fillings without breaking, flexible enough to shape without cracking, and flaky enough to provide pleasant eating texture. Egyptian pastry makers developed recipes and techniques that achieved all these requirements simultaneously. The fillings were where creativity really shined. Sweet versions might contain date paste mixed with chopped nuts and aromatic spices. Savory options could include seasoned legume mixtures or preserved fish combinations that provided protein and complex flavors. Each filling type required specific dough treatments and baking approaches. The construction process was almost architectural. Dough had to be rolled to precise thickness, filled with exact amounts to prevent bursting, and sealed with techniques that ensured the pastries would hold together during baking while allowing steam to escape safely. Different filling types required different baking strategies. Moist fillings needed dough that could handle steam without becoming soggy. Dry fillings required careful moisture management to prevent the dough from becoming too crispy and hard to bite through. The finished pastries were complete meals disguised as snacks. They provided balanced nutrition, complex flavors, and satisfying textures, all in convenient, portable packages. Workers could carry several pastries and have everything they needed for sustained energy and eating pleasure. These filled pastries became the ancestors of countless modern snack foods, demonstrating that the concept of engineered convenience foods is far older than most people realize. Egyptian pastry makers were solving the same challenges that occupy modern food scientists, just with different tools and ingredients. The legacy of these ancient Egyptian junk foods extends far beyond their immediate time and place. The techniques, concepts, and approaches they developed laid groundwork for snack traditions that spread throughout the ancient world and continue to influence how we think about convenient, pleasurable eating today. What's remarkable is how these ancient snack makers balance nutrition, flavor, preservation, and social function in ways that many modern snack foods fail to achieve. They understood that eating should be pleasurable, but they never forgot that food needed to serve practical purposes in challenging environments. Their innovations in fermentation, preservation, flavor concentration, and texture manipulation represent sophisticated food science achieved through observation, experimentation, and generations of accumulated knowledge. Modern food technologists study ancient techniques to rediscover approaches that industrial food production has forgotten. The social aspects of these snacks remind us that eating has always been about more than nutrition. Ancient Egyptian treats brought families together, marked important occasions, demonstrated hospitality, and created shared experiences that strengthened community bonds. They understood that food is culture, and snacks are expressions of creativity and care. Perhaps most importantly, these ancient Egyptian snack makers approached food with a sense of joy and possibility that modern consumers can learn from. They saw basic ingredients as raw materials for creativity, not limitations to accept. They understood that even simple pleasures like crunchy, sweet, or savory snacks could be elevated through skill, attention, and genuine care for the people who would enjoy them. From fermented grain pastes to candied flowers, the ancient Egyptians had clearly mastered the art of transforming simple ingredients into complex pleasures. But their snacking innovations didn't stop there. They developed something that would make modern nutritionists weep with joy while simultaneously horrifying them. Pickled vegetable medleys that were essentially ancient probiotics disguised as tangy treats. The pickling process wasn't the vinegar-based preservation we know today. Instead, Egyptian pickle makers relied on salt brines and controlled fermentation to transform fresh vegetables into something entirely new. They'd take whatever was seasonally abundant, turnips, radishes, onions, even lotus stems when available, and pack them into clay jars with salt solutions that had been carefully calculated through generations of trial and error. The fermentation that followed was pure magic. Beneficial bacteria would begin breaking down the vegetable fibers while producing acids that preserved the food and created complex, tangy flavors that were completely addictive. The process took weeks, with the pickle makers checking their jars daily, listening for the subtle sounds of active fermentation, and adjusting salt levels based on temperature and humidity. What emerged from these clay vessels was unlike anything in the regular Egyptian diet. The vegetables maintained their crunch, but developed sour, salty, sometimes slightly effervescent qualities that made your mouth water instantly. Each bite delivered a burst of acidity that cut through the richness of other foods, while providing genuine nutritional benefits that their makers didn't even understand. These pickled vegetables became the perfect complement to heavy meals of bread and meat. Workers would carry small portions in leather pouches, using them to add excitement to otherwise monotonous field rations. The acidity helped with digestion, while the salt replaced what was lost through constant sweating in the desert heat. But here's what made Egyptian pickles special. They weren't just preserved vegetables. They were flavor enhancers that could transform entire meals. A few pieces of pickled turnip could make stale bread taste fresh and interesting. Pickled onions added sharpness that woke up tired palates. The brine itself became a condiment, drizzled over bland foods to add complexity and excitement. The social ritual around pickle making brought neighborhoods together. Families would coordinate their vegetable harvests and share brining techniques, creating community pickle projects that strengthened bonds while ensuring everyone had access to preserved foods during lean seasons. The sound of chopping vegetables and the aroma of fermenting brine became associated with preparation and security. Now, let's explore something that showcases Egyptian ingenuity in its most practical form. Compressed travel cakes that were essentially ancient power bars, but engineered specifically for the challenges of long-distance desert travel. These weren't casual snacks. They were survival tools that could mean the difference between life and death on caravan routes. The foundation was dates that had been processed into thick pastes, but not the simple mashed fruit you might imagine. These dates were carefully selected for ripeness, cleaned of pits and debris, then ground with stone mortars until they achieved a consistency that was smooth but not liquid. The natural sugars concentrated during this process, creating a base that was intensely sweet and packed with quick energy. But dates alone wouldn't sustain travelers through weeks of desert crossing. Egyptian travel cake makers discovered that adding groundnuts and seeds provided the fats and proteins necessary for sustained energy. Almonds, when available through trade, were prized for their rich oils. More commonly, they used indigenous seeds that had been carefully roasted to develop complex flavors while improving digestibility. The compression technique was where real engineering came into play. The mixture had to be pressed with enough force to create dense, durable cakes that wouldn't crumble in saddlebags, but not so much that they became rock hard and impossible to bite. Special wooden presses were developed specifically for this purpose, with leverage systems that allowed consistent pressure application. The finished travel cakes were marvels of food engineering. Each one contained balanced nutrition in the most compact form possible. They were wrapped in treated leather or cloth to protect them from sand and moisture, then packed in quantities calculated to sustain travelers for specific journey lengths. Caravan leaders would calculate rations based on route difficulty, weather expectations, and the physical demands different travelers would face. These cakes didn't just provide nutrition. They provided psychological comfort to people facing the dangers of desert travel. Knowing you had reliable food supplies allowed travelers to focus on navigation, weather, and other survival challenges without the constant worry of starvation. The cakes became symbols of preparation and competence. Different regions developed signature variations based on local ingredients and trade connections. Some areas produced cakes with exotic spices that had arrived via trading routes. Others focused on maximum nutritional density, using locally abundant materials. The best travel cake makers gained reputations that extended across trade networks. But Egyptian snack makers weren't content to focus only on practical survival foods. They also developed treats that were pure indulgence, designed specifically for pleasure rather than necessity. Candied nuts that transformed simple almonds or other nuts into jewel-like confections that dissolve slowly on the tongue while delivering waves of concentrated sweetness. The candying process was incredibly labor-intensive and required precise timing at every stage. Fresh nuts had to be selected for size, quality, and oil content. They were first blanched in boiling water to remove any bitter compounds, then carefully dried to exact moisture levels that would allow proper sugar penetration without compromising texture. The syrup preparation was an art form in itself. Honey was heated slowly in specially designed clay pots, with constant stirring to prevent burning, while achieving the exact temperature needed for proper candying. The timing was critical because the honey had to be hot enough to penetrate the nuts completely, but not so hot that it would burn them or create bitter off flavors. Once the honey reached the perfect temperature, nuts were added in small batches to ensure even coating. Each nut had to be individually turned and coated, a process that required steady hands and complete attention. The candied nuts were then removed and placed on oiled surfaces to cool and harden. The finished products were unlike anything else in the Egyptian diet. Each nut was encased in a hard, glossy shell of crystallized honey that cracked between your teeth to reveal the tender, flavorful nut inside. The contrast between the sweet, brittle coating and the rich, oily nut created an eating experience that was both satisfying and luxurious. These candied nuts became the ultimate status symbol. They required expensive ingredients, skilled labor, and considerable time to produce. Serving candied nuts to guests demonstrated serious wealth and respect. They were given as gifts during important ceremonies and saved for the most special occasions. Children were absolutely fascinated by candied nuts, but they were far too precious to be casual treats. Parents would use them as rewards for exceptional behavior or comfort during illness. The rarity made each nut feel like a treasure, something to be savored slowly and remembered long after eating. Moving on to something that demonstrates the sophisticated understanding ancient Egyptians had developed about flavor pairing. Herb-infused honey that transformed the basic sweetener into complex flavor delivery systems that could enhance other foods in ways that seem almost modern in their sophistication. The process began with selecting honey at specific stages of crystallization. Fresh, liquid honey was too thin and would not hold herb flavors properly. Fully crystallized honey was too solid to infuse effectively. Egyptian honey masters learned to work with honey at intermediate stages, where it retained enough liquid properties to absorb flavors while being thick enough to trap aromatic compounds. The herbs themselves were chosen not just for their flavors, but for their compatibility with honey and their preservation qualities. Mint provided cooling sensations that balanced honey's intense sweetness. Rosemary added piney, almost medicinal notes that created complexity. When available, imported spices like cinnamon or cardamom transformed ordinary honey into exotic luxuries. The infusion technique required patience and precise temperature control. Herbs were added to warmed honey in carefully calculated proportions. Then the mixture was maintained at specific temperatures for days or even weeks. Too much heat would destroy delicate aromatic compounds. Too little heat wouldn't extract the full range of flavors available in the herbs. Different herbs required different extraction approaches. Delicate flowers needed gentle treatment that preserved their subtle essences. Tougher leaves and stems could handle more aggressive extraction that pulled out deeper, more complex flavor compounds. Master honeymakers developed specialized techniques for each type of plant material they worked with. The finished herb-infused honeys were revelations of flavor complexity. A single spoonful could deliver the sweetness of honey, followed by waves of herbal notes that seemed to change and develop as you tasted them. Some combinations created warming sensations. Others provided cooling effects that were especially prized during hot weather. These flavored honeys weren't just eaten directly. They became ingredients that elevated other foods to new levels of sophistication. Plain bread became gourmet when drizzled with mint-infused honey. Simple grain porridges transformed into complex breakfast experiences with the addition of herb honeys. Even water became a flavored beverage when mixed with small amounts of infused honey. The medicinal applications were equally important. Different herb combinations were believed to provide specific health benefits that were concentrated and preserved in the honey medium. Digestive herbs created honeys that were consumed after heavy meals. Calming herbs produced honeys used as sleep aids. The honey not only made the medicine more palatable, but also served as a preservation medium that extended the useful life of herbal preparations. Now here's something that showcases Egyptian innovation at its most creative. Layered fruit and nut confections that were essentially ancient parfaits, but constructed with engineering precision to create specific eating experiences that reveal different flavors and textures in carefully planned sequences. The construction process was architectural in its complexity. Different fruit preparations were developed for different layers, each optimized for its specific role in the final confection. Base layers needed to be firm and stable, typically made from date pastes that had been compressed and shaped to provide structural support. Middle layers featured different fruit combinations that complemented each other while adding visual appeal and flavor variety. Some layers were made from single fruits that had been processed to specific textures. Others combined multiple fruits in ratios that had been perfected through generations of experimentation. Top layers were designed for immediate visual and flavor impact. These often featured the most expensive or exotic ingredients available, arranged in patterns that demonstrated the maker's skill and the recipient's importance. Nuts might be arranged in geometric patterns or rare fruits might be placed to create colorful designs. The binding between layers required sophisticated understanding of how different moisture levels and textures would interact over time. Too much moisture in any layer could cause the confection to collapse or develop off flavors. Too little moisture would prevent proper adhesion and create layers that separated when cut. Each layer had to be allowed to set properly before the next layer was added, a process that could take days for complex confections. The timing was critical because each layer needed to be at exactly the right stage of firmness to bond properly with the next addition. The finished confections were edible sculptures that told stories through their construction. Religious confections might feature layers that represented different aspects of Egyptian cosmology. Celebration confections could include layers that represented the seasons or important life events. Each bite revealed new combinations as different layers mixed on the palate. These layered confections became centerpieces of important feasts, presented with ceremony appropriate to their complexity and cost. Cutting and serving them was almost ritualistic, with each slice revealing the internal structure that demonstrated the maker's skill and planning. But let's explore something that demonstrates the practical side of Egyptian treat making. Concentrated soup cubes that were essentially ancient bouillon, but made with techniques and ingredients that created complex flavor bases for enhancing simple foods. These weren't just survival rations. They were flavor enhancement systems that could transform basic ingredients into satisfying meals. The base was typically meat or fish that had been cooked slowly until all the flavors were extracted into rich broths. But instead of consuming these broths immediately, Egyptian cooks discovered they could concentrate them through careful reduction until they became thick pastes that could be shaped and dried. The concentration process required constant attention and precise timing. The broths were heated in shallow clay pans, with continuous stirring to prevent burning while encouraging even evaporation. As the water content decreased, the flavors intensified and concentrated, creating pastes that were incredibly rich and complex. Vegetables and herbs were often added during the concentration process, contributing their own flavors while also helping to bind the mixture into stable forms. Onions provided sweetness and depth, while aromatic herbs added complexity that made the finished cubes more than just concentrated protein. The shaping and drying process transformed the pastes into portable flavor, concentrates that could last for months without spoiling. The cubes were typically formed by pressing the paste into molds, then drying them slowly in controlled conditions until they achieved the right balance between hardness and solubility. These soup cubes revolutionized food preparation for travelers, workers, and anyone who needed to prepare meals quickly with minimal ingredients. A single cube could transform plain water and grains into a satisfying, flavorful soup that provided both nutrition and eating pleasure. The convenience factor was incredible for its time. Instead of carrying multiple ingredients and cooking equipment, travelers could pack light supplies of grains and vegetables along with a few soup cubes, knowing they could create complete meals anywhere they found water and fuel for cooking. Different regions developed signature cube formulations based on local ingredients and preferences. Some featured fish-based flavors that were particularly popular in areas near the Nile. Others focused on meat-based concentrates that provided the hearty flavors preferred by people engaged in heavy physical labor. Speaking of innovation, ancient Egyptians also developed something that would make modern snack food engineers jealous: puffed grain snacks that were created by heating grains under controlled conditions until they expanded into light, crispy morsels that were completely different from their original dense forms. The technique was discovered somewhat accidentally when grains being roasted in clay pots were heated to higher temperatures than usual. Instead of just browning, some grains actually popped and expanded, creating airy, crunchy textures that were unlike anything else in the Egyptian diet. Egyptian grain puffers learned to control this process by managing temperature, moisture content, and timing with precision, that seems almost scientific. Different grains required different approaches, and the successful practitioners developed techniques that allowed them to achieve consistent results, batch after batch. The process began with selecting grains at exactly the right moisture content. Too dry and they wouldn't puff properly. Too moist and they would burn before expanding. The grains were often soaked briefly, then dried to precise levels that experience had shown produced optimal puffing results. The heating was done in specially designed clay vessels that could reach and maintain the high temperatures necessary for grain expansion. The grains were stirred constantly to ensure even heating while preventing burning. The sound of grains popping became the signal that the process was working correctly. The finished puffed grains were revelations of texture and flavor. What had started as dense, chewy grains became light, airy snacks that seemed to dissolve on the tongue while delivering concentrated grain flavors. The puffing process intensified the natural nuttiness of the grains while creating textures that were completely new to Egyptian cuisine. These puffed grains became popular with children who loved their light, crunchy texture and mild flavors. Adults appreciated them as snacks that provided satisfaction without the heaviness of bread or other dense foods. They were perfect for eating between meals or during activities that required sustained energy without digestive burden. The puffed grains could also be seasoned after processing, creating variations that appealed to different tastes. Salt from desert deposits created savory versions, while honey drizzles produced sweet treats that combined the light grain texture with concentrated sweetness. Some innovative cooks discovered they could press puffed grains together with honey or other binding agents to create bars or cakes that maintained the light texture while adding structural integrity. These pressed puffed grain treats became portable snacks that combined convenience with unique eating experiences. Now let's talk about something that demonstrates the sophisticated understanding ancient Egyptians had developed about texture manipulation. Gelatin-like confections made from plant-based gelling agents that created treats with textures that were completely unique in their food culture. The gelling agents came from various plant sources that Egyptian cooks had identified through experimentation and observation. Some were extracted from seaweeds that grew in coastal areas. Others came from tree saps or plant roots that contained natural compounds capable of creating gel structures when properly processed. The extraction process was complex and required specialized knowledge that was often closely guarded by families or professional confectioners. Plant materials had to be processed at specific temperatures and pH levels to extract the gelling compounds without destroying their effectiveness. Once extracted, these gelling agents could be combined with fruit juices, honey solutions, or other flavoring ingredients to create confections that held their shape while providing unique eating experiences. The texture was unlike anything else in Egyptian cuisine, soft and yielding, but not liquid, flavorful, but not overwhelming. Different gelling agents produced different texture characteristics, and skilled confectioners learned to select the right agent for specific applications. Some created firm gels that could be cut into shapes and handled easily. Others produced softer textures that were more like modern puddings or custards. The flavoring possibilities were endless. Fruit juices created colorful, intensely flavored gels that were both beautiful and delicious. Honey solutions produced golden confections that were elegantly sweet. Herb infusions created gels with complex flavors that were both treats and medicine. These gel confections became special occasion foods, reserved for important celebrations or offered to honored guests. Their unique textures and often translucent appearances made them seem almost magical, like edible jewels that captured light and flavor in ways that solid foods couldn't match. The cooling properties of gel confections made them particularly prized during hot weather. Unlike other sweets that could become unpleasantly sticky or overwhelming in heat, gel confections remained refreshing and pleasant to eat regardless of temperature. Children were fascinated by the unusual textures and would often play with gel confections before eating them, enjoying the way they moved and responded to touch. Parents appreciated that these treats provided hydration along with sweetness, making them practical as well as enjoyable. Finally, let's explore something that brings us full circle to the sophisticated understanding ancient Egyptians had developed about the social and cultural roles of treats in daily life. Ceremonial snack platters that were carefully arranged combinations of different treats, each chosen for specific symbolic meanings and flavor contributions to create complete experiences that were greater than the sum of their parts. These weren't random assortments of available treats. They were thoughtfully composed presentations that told stories, conveyed messages, and created specific eating experiences that enhanced social gatherings and important occasions. The selection and arrangement of treats required deep understanding of flavors, textures, colors, and cultural meanings. The composition process began with considering the occasion and the intended message. Religious ceremonies required treats with sacred associations and appropriate symbolic meanings. Celebrations called for combinations that represented joy, abundance, and shared happiness. Diplomatic gatherings needed selections that demonstrated respect, wealth, and cultural sophistication. Each treat on the platter was chosen not only for its individual qualities, but for how it would interact with the other selections. Flavors needed to complement rather than compete with each other. Textures should provide variety and interest throughout the eating experience. Colors and shapes should create visual appeal that enhanced the overall presentation. The arrangement itself was an art form that required understanding of visual composition, practical access, and eating sequences. More delicate treats might be positioned where they would be protected from damage. Strongly flavored items could be placed to avoid overwhelming subtler selections. The flow of the arrangement should guide guests through planned flavor progressions. These ceremonial platters became expressions of the host's sophistication, resources, and respect for guests. The time, skill, and expensive ingredients required to create impressive presentations demonstrated serious commitment to hospitality and social relationships. But beyond their social functions, these platters represented the culmination of Egyptian snack food development. They showcased the incredible variety of treats that had been developed, the sophisticated understanding of flavor and texture combinations that had evolved, and the cultural importance that had been placed on food as more than mere sustenance. The legacy of these ancient Egyptian snack innovations extends far beyond their immediate time and place, influencing food traditions that spread throughout the ancient world and continue to shape how we think about treats and snacking today. Their understanding that food should be pleasurable, social, and meaningful, while also serving practical nutritional needs, remains as relevant now as it was 4,000 years ago. What's most remarkable about ancient Egyptian junk food culture is how it balanced indulgence with purpose, creativity with practicality, and individual pleasure with social responsibility. These weren't people mindlessly consuming empty calories. They were thoughtful food innovators who understood that treats could serve multiple functions in human life while still being genuinely enjoyable and satisfying. Their techniques for concentrating flavors, manipulating textures, and preserving foods represent sophisticated food science achieved through careful observation and generations of accumulated knowledge. Modern food technologists continue to study these ancient approaches, often rediscovering principles that industrial food production has overlooked or forgotten. The social aspects of Egyptian treat culture remind us that eating has always been about community, celebration, and cultural expression as much as nutrition. Their snacks brought people together, marked important occasions, and created shared experiences that strengthened social bonds across all levels of society. Perhaps most importantly, these ancient Egyptian snack makers understood something that modern food culture sometimes forgets. Treats weren't just about immediate gratification. They were investments in relationships, expressions of creativity, and bridges between the mundane and the sacred. Every honey cake shared with a neighbor, every date ball offered to a traveler, every pickled vegetable passed around a work crew represented an acknowledgement that life should contain moments of sweetness and joy, even in the harshest circumstances. But let's dive into something that shows just how far ahead of their time these ancient snack innovators really were. Fermented grain beverages that were essentially ancient smoothies, but with complexity that would make modern kombucha makers weep with envy. These weren't just drinks, they were liquid snacks that provided nutrition, probiotics, and mild intoxication, all in one frothy, slightly effervescent package. The process started with grains that had been allowed to sprout slightly, activating enzymes that would break down starches into more digestible sugars. These sprouted grains were then ground into coarse meals and mixed with water in large clay vessels that had been seasoned through years of use, developing colonies of beneficial bacteria and wild yeasts that would jumpstart fermentation. What happened next was pure biological magic that Egyptian brewers learned to control through generations of careful observation. The wild microorganisms would begin working on the grain sugars, producing acids that preserved the mixture while creating complex flavors that ranged from mildly tart to intensely sour, depending on fermentation time and conditions. But here's where it gets really interesting. These fermented grain beverages weren't uniform products. Each batch was unique, influenced by weather, seasonal variations in grain quality, and the particular microbial ecosystem that had developed in each brewing vessel. Egyptian brewers learned to read these variations, adjusting ingredients and timing to achieve desired flavor profiles. The finished beverages were thick, almost chewy, with textures that required serious jaw involvement. You didn't just drink these concoctions, you experienced them. Each sip delivered layers of flavor that changed as the liquid warmed in your mouth. The initial tartness might give way to underlying grain sweetness, followed by subtle funkiness from the fermentation process. Workers absolutely loved these fermented beverages because they provided sustained energy without the heaviness of solid food. You could sip them throughout the day, getting nutrition and mild alcoholic relaxation that made long hours of physical labor more bearable. The probiotics, though nobody understood the science, kept digestive systems healthy in ways that pure alcohol never could. Children got watered-down versions that provided the beneficial bacteria and complex flavors without enough alcohol to cause problems. Parents appreciated that these drinks were actually healthier than plain water, while being far more appealing to young palates that might resist other nutritious options. The social aspects were incredible too. Sharing fermented grain beverages became a bonding ritual that created connections between people. The slightly intoxicating effects lowered social barriers, while the complex preparation process gave communities shared projects that brought them together around common goals. Now let's talk about something that demonstrates the incredible ingenuity ancient Egyptians brought to food preservation. Salt-cured meat strips that were essentially ancient jerky, but made with techniques that created flavors and textures that would challenge your preconceptions about what preserved meat could taste like. The meat selection process was incredibly sophisticated. Egyptian jerky makers understood that different cuts required different treatment approaches. Lean muscles from active animals produced jerky with intense flavors and firm textures. Fattier cuts needed careful handling to prevent rancidity while maintaining richness that made the finished product more satisfying. The salt curing wasn't just about preservation. Egyptian jerky makers had access to different types of salt with varying mineral contents that contributed unique flavors to the finished product. Desert salts had different characteristics than salts obtained through evaporating water from salt lakes. Each type created distinct flavor profiles in the cured meat. The spice treatments were where real artistry came into play. Different spice combinations were developed for different seasons, different types of meat, and different intended uses. Some jerky was seasoned for immediate consumption, with bold flavors that provided instant gratification. Other batches were prepared for long-term storage, with spice combinations that would develop and improve over months of aging. The drying process required constant attention and perfect timing. Meat had to be dried slowly enough to develop complex flavors through enzymatic action, but quickly enough to prevent spoilage. Egyptian jerky makers developed techniques for controlling airflow, temperature, and humidity that allowed them to achieve consistent results even in challenging desert conditions. The finished jerky was unlike anything we might recognize today. Some pieces were so thoroughly dried, they resembled leather strips that required serious commitment to chew through. Others retained enough moisture to provide immediate flavor release while still being shelf-stable for extended periods. But here's what made Egyptian jerky special beyond its preservation qualities. The flavor development during the curing and drying process created taste experiences that were completely unique. The combination of salt, spices, and controlled decomposition produced umami-rich flavors that were intensely satisfying in ways that fresh meat could never match. These jerky strips became currency in their own right, traded between communities, and used as diplomatic gifts that demonstrated both practical value and cultural sophistication. High-quality jerky makers gained reputations that extended across trade networks, with their products being specifically requested by travelers and merchants. Moving on to something that showcases the playful side of Egyptian food culture. Shaped grain crackers that were essentially ancient animal cookies, but made with whole grain flours and natural sweeteners that provided genuine nutrition along with whimsical entertainment value. The cracker dough was based on ground grains, mixed with just enough liquid to create workable consistency. But the real skill lay in achieving the perfect balance between structural integrity and eating pleasure. Too much liquid, and the crackers would lose their shapes during baking. Too little, and they would be too crumbly to handle or too hard to bite through comfortably. The shaping process was where creativity really flourished. Egyptian cracker makers developed an entire menagerie of animal forms, each requiring specific techniques to achieve recognizable results. Bird shapes needed careful attention to wing details that would remain visible after baking. Fish shapes required scoring techniques that would create scale patterns during the browning process. The baking was done on flat stones that had been heated to precise temperatures through careful fire management. Different shapes required different baking approaches because thickness variations affected cooking times. Thin areas like bird wings needed protection from overcooking, while thicker body sections required enough heat to cook through completely. Children were absolutely fascinated by these shaped crackers, using them as toys before eventually eating them. The educational value was significant too, as parents used the different animal shapes to teach children about the creatures they represented, their behaviors, and their roles in Egyptian culture and religion. The crackers weren't just novelty items either. They provided genuine nutrition from whole grain flours, natural oils, and whatever seeds or nuts were incorporated into the dough. Parents appreciated that they could give children treats that were actually beneficial rather than just empty indulgence. Special occasions called for elaborate cracker presentations featuring entire scenes created from multiple animal shapes. Religious festivals might include crackers representing sacred animals associated with different gods. Harvest celebrations could feature crackers shaped like the animals that had helped with agricultural work. The social aspects of cracker making brought communities together around shared creative activities. Families would gather to shape dough, sharing techniques and competing good-naturedly to create the most detailed and recognizable animal forms. The process became as important as the finished products. Now here's something that demonstrates the sophisticated understanding ancient Egyptians had developed about flavor layering. Compound butters made by mixing rendered animal fats with herbs, spices, and other aromatics to create spreadable flavor concentrates that could transform simple bread into complex eating experiences. The fat rendering process was carefully controlled to preserve the natural flavors while removing impurities that could cause rancidity. Different animals provided fats with different characteristics, and Egyptian butter makers learned to select the right base for specific flavor applications. Goose fat created rich, luxurious butters perfect for special occasions. Sheep fat produced more economical versions that still delivered significant flavor enhancement. The herb and spice additions were where real expertise showed. Different aromatic plants were processed in different ways to maximize their contributions to the finished butter. Some herbs were used fresh to provide bright, immediate flavors. Others were dried and ground to create deeper, more concentrated tastes that would develop over time. The mixing process required understanding of how different ingredients would interact as the butter aged. Some combinations improved with time, developing complexity that wasn't apparent in freshly made batches. Others needed to be consumed quickly before delicate flavors were overwhelmed by stronger components. Temperature management during preparation was crucial because different mixing temperatures affected how thoroughly ingredients combined and how well flavors melded together. Too cold, and ingredients wouldn't distribute evenly. Too warm and delicate aromatics would be lost before the butter could be properly stored. The finished compound butters were stored in sealed clay containers that protected them from air and light, while allowing controlled aging that developed optimal flavor profiles. Different storage conditions produced different results, and master butter makers developed techniques for achieving specific characteristics in their products. These flavored butters weren't just condiments, they were flavor transformation systems that could make simple foods taste extraordinary. A slice of ordinary bread became a gourmet experience when spread with herb butter that had been aged to perfect complexity. Plain cooked grains turned into sophisticated side dishes with the addition of spiced butter that provided richness and depth. The social status associated with compound butters was significant because they represented both skill and resources. The time required for proper preparation and aging, combined with the cost of quality ingredients, meant that serving flavored butters demonstrated serious commitment to hospitality and guest comfort. But let's explore something that shows how ancient Egyptians approached the challenge of creating satisfying snacks from limited ingredients. Expanded grain cakes that were made by mixing cooked grains with binding agents, then forming them into shapes that were dried until they became light, portable snacks with surprisingly complex textures and flavors. The grain cooking process was optimized for maximum expansion and flavor development. Grains were cooked in just enough liquid to achieve perfect tenderness without becoming mushy. The timing was critical because overcooked grains would lose their structural integrity, while undercooked grains would remain hard and difficult to bind together. The binding agents varied depending on what was available and the intended characteristics of the finished cakes. Honey provided sweetness and strong binding power, but created cakes that were quite dense. Date paste offered similar binding with different flavor profiles. Ground nuts mixed with small amounts of oil created bindings that produced lighter textures. The forming process required speed and precision because the grain mixture had to be shaped while it was still warm and pliable. Different shapes required different techniques, and experienced cake makers developed skills that allowed them to create consistent results, even when working with variable ingredients. The drying process was where the real transformation occurred. As moisture evaporated from the shaped cakes, the binding agents concentrated and hardened, while the grains maintained their expanded structure. The result was light, airy cakes that had much more substance than their weight suggested. The finished grain cakes provided sustained energy in forms that were easy to carry and pleasant to eat. They could be nibbled slowly throughout the day or consumed quickly when immediate energy was needed. The complex carbohydrates from the grains provided steady fuel that lasted much longer than simple sugar-based treats. Different grain combinations produced cakes with different characteristics. Barley-based cakes had nutty flavors and substantial textures. Wheat-based versions were milder and more delicate. Mixed grain cakes offered complexity that kept taste buds interested through extended eating sessions. These cakes became essential supplies for anyone traveling or working away from home for extended periods. Their lightweight and long storage life made them practical choices for situations where carrying capacity was limited, but nutritional needs remained high. Speaking of practical innovations, ancient Egyptians also developed something that would impress modern food scientists. Protein-enriched seed cakes made by combining ground legumes with various seeds and nuts to create compact nutrition sources that provided complete amino acid profiles while tasting genuinely delicious. The legume processing was sophisticated, involving soaking, cooking, and grinding techniques that maximized protein availability while minimizing the digestive issues that can come from eating large quantities of beans or lentils. Different legumes required different treatment approaches, and Egyptian processors developed specialized knowledge for handling each variety. The seed and nut additions weren't random. Egyptian nutritionists, though they wouldn't have understood the science, had learned through observation that certain combinations provided better sustained energy and overall health benefits than others. Sesame seeds paired with lentils created combinations that we now know provide complete proteins. The grinding and mixing process required achieving exactly the right texture balance. The mixture needed to hold together when formed into cakes, but it couldn't be ground so fine that it became paste-like. The ideal texture provided interesting chewing experiences, while ensuring that all the nutritional components were easily digestible. The binding was typically achieved through the natural oils released during grinding, supplemented with small amounts of honey or date paste when additional sweetening was desired. The goal was to create cakes that held together reliably without masking the natural flavors of the seeds and legumes. These protein cakes became essential nutrition for people engaged in heavy physical labor or those recovering from illness. The complete protein content supported muscle development and repair, while the complex carbohydrates provided sustained energy that lasted through long work sessions. The cakes were often prescribed by Egyptian healers for specific health conditions. Different combinations were believed to provide different medicinal benefits, and the concentrated nutrition format made it easy for patients to consume therapeutic amounts of beneficial compounds. Now let's talk about something that demonstrates the incredible creativity ancient Egyptians brought to dessert making. Layered sweet terrines that were constructed by alternating different colored and flavored mixtures to create cross-sections that revealed beautiful patterns when sliced, like edible stained glass windows. The construction process required planning that would challenge modern pastry chefs. Each layer had to be formulated with the right consistency to maintain its shape while bonding properly with adjacent layers. Colors had to be chosen not just for visual appeal, but for how they would interact as flavors combined on the palate. The colored mixtures came from various natural sources that provided both visual interest and distinct flavors. Date pastes created rich brown layers with intense sweetness. Ground nuts mixed with honey produced golden layers with complex, nutty flavors. When available, imported fruits provided layers and colors that couldn't be achieved with local ingredients. The layering sequence was critical because different mixtures had different setting characteristics. Some layers needed to firm up completely before the next addition, while others worked better when applied, while the previous layer was still slightly soft. Master terrine makers developed timing sequences that ensured perfect adhesion without compromising the distinct identity of each layer. The setting process took place in specially shaped molds that had been lined with materials that would prevent sticking while allowing controlled moisture loss. Different mold shapes produced different final presentations, from simple rectangular terrines that showcased horizontal layering to more complex curved forms that created swirling patterns. The finished terrines were works of art that happened to be edible. When sliced, they revealed intricate patterns that demonstrated the maker's skill and planning. Each slice was unique, with slight variations in layer thickness and color distribution that made every piece a small surprise. These layered confections became centerpieces of the most important celebrations, presented with ceremony appropriate to their complexity and beauty. The cutting and serving became ritual acts that added significance to already special occasions. But ancient Egyptians didn't limit their innovations to sweet treats. They also developed savory snacks that were just as sophisticated and satisfying. Seasoned vegetable leather made from pureed vegetables that had been spiced, then dried into flexible sheets that could be eaten like chips or used as wrapping for other foods. The vegetable selection process focused on varieties that would provide good nutrition while creating appealing flavors and textures when dried. Root vegetables like turnips provided earthy bases with natural sweetness. Leafy greens contributed vitamins and minerals while adding complexity to flavor profiles. The pureeing technique was designed to create smooth, uniform mixtures that would dry evenly without developing weak spots that might crack or tear during handling. The vegetables were typically cooked briefly to soften them before grinding, but not so much that they lost their nutritional value or structural integrity. The seasoning was where creativity really flourished. Different spice combinations created vegetable leathers with completely different characteristics. Some were seasoned for immediate consumption, with bold flavors that provided instant satisfaction. Others were spiced for long-term storage, with combinations that would improve during aging. The drying process required careful monitoring to achieve the right balance between flexibility and durability. Over-dried sheets became brittle and difficult to handle. Under-dried sheets were prone to spoilage and had unpleasant textures that made eating them unenjoyable. The finished vegetable leather provided portable nutrition that was completely different from any other food in the Egyptian diet. The concentrated vegetable flavors were intense and satisfying, while the chewy texture provided eating experiences that lasted much longer than fresh vegetables. These vegetable leathers became essential supplies for travelers and workers who needed reliable nutrition in forms that wouldn't spoil quickly. They could be eaten as snacks or rehydrated in soups and stews to add vegetable nutrition to otherwise simple meals. Finally, let's explore something that brings together all the themes we've discussed about ancient Egyptian snack culture. Festival assortment platters that were carefully curated collections of different treats, each chosen for specific roles in creating complete celebratory experiences that engaged all the senses while telling stories about Egyptian culture and values. These weren't random collections of available treats. They were thoughtfully composed presentations that required deep understanding of flavor interactions, textural contrasts, visual composition, and cultural symbolism. The selection process began months before major festivals, with treat makers planning production schedules and ingredient procurement to ensure everything would be ready at optimal quality. The variety was staggering. A single festival platter might include honey cakes shaped like sacred animals, date balls rolled in chopped nuts, pickled vegetables arranged in geometric patterns, seasoned grain crackers formed into hieroglyphic symbols, fermented fruit pastes in multiple flavors, and candied flowers that had been preserved at peak beauty. The arrangement process was an art form that required understanding of how different treats would interact visually and practically. Delicate items needed protection from moisture or crushing. Strongly flavored treats had to be positioned to avoid overwhelming subtler selections. The flow of the arrangement should guide guests through planned sequences of tastes and textures. But these festival platters served purposes beyond just providing food. They were cultural education tools that taught children about Egyptian traditions, religious beliefs, and social values through the treats they contained. Each element had stories and meanings that were shared as the platters were enjoyed. The social aspects were equally important. Creating festival platters required community cooperation, with different families contributing their specialties to create presentations that no single household could achieve alone. The sharing process strengthened social bonds while ensuring that everyone could participate in celebrations, regardless of their individual resources. These elaborate treat collections represented the pinnacle of Egyptian snack culture, showcasing the incredible variety, sophistication, and cultural integration that had developed over centuries of innovation and refinement. They demonstrated that food could be far more than sustenance, serving as art, education, social bonding, and cultural expression all simultaneously. The legacy of these ancient Egyptian snack innovations continues to influence how we think about treats, celebrations, and the role of food in human culture. Their understanding that snacks should provide pleasure, nutrition, social connection, and cultural meaning remains as relevant today as it was 4,000 years ago, reminding us that the best food innovations serve multiple purposes while bringing genuine joy to daily life. The logistics of creating these festival platters revealed just how organized ancient Egyptian society had become around food production. Specialized treat makers would begin preparation weeks in advance, coordinating harvests, trade acquisitions, and production schedules with the precision of modern supply chain managers. Different neighborhoods might specialize in different types of treats, creating informal networks that ensured variety while preventing any single household from being overwhelmed by preparation demands. But here's something that might surprise you about ancient Egyptian snacking culture. They had developed what we can only describe as ancient energy drinks. Fermented fruit and grain beverages that provided quick energy, mild intoxication, and complex flavors all in one fizzy, slightly alcoholic package that would make modern kombucha enthusiasts weep with envy. The preparation started with overripe fruits that were past their prime for fresh eating but perfect for fermentation. Dates that had begun to soften, figs that were starting to wrinkle, grapes that had developed concentrated sugars. These fruits were mashed together with cooked grains, usually barley that had been allowed to cool to specific temperatures that would encourage the right kind of microbial activity. What happened next was controlled chaos. Wild yeasts from the air would begin working on the fruit and grain sugars, creating alcohol while beneficial bacteria produced acids that gave the mixture its characteristic tang. The fermentation vessels, large clay pots that had been seasoned through years of use, harbored colonies of microorganisms that jump-started the process and influenced the final flavor profiles. Egyptian brewers learned to read the signs of successful fermentation through sound, smell, and visual cues that modern scientists are only beginning to understand. The gentle bubbling indicated healthy yeast activity. Specific aromas signaled that the right balance of alcohol and acid was developing. Surface changes showed when the fermentation was progressing properly versus when intervention might be needed. The finished beverages were thick, almost chewy, with textures that required serious engagement from your jaw muscles. You didn't just drink these concoctions, you experienced them. Each sip delivered waves of flavor that changed as the liquid warmed in your mouth. The initial sweetness from residual fruit sugars would give way to tartness from fermentation acids, followed by subtle funkiness that spoke of the complex microbial ecosystem that had created the drink. Workers absolutely loved these fermented beverages because they provided sustained energy without the heaviness of solid food. You could sip them throughout long days of physical labor, getting nutrition and mild relaxation that made difficult work more bearable. The natural probiotics, though nobody understood the science, kept digestive systems healthy in ways that pure alcohol never could, but the social aspects were equally important. Sharing fermented beverages became bonding rituals that created connections between people from different backgrounds and social levels. The slightly intoxicating effects lowered barriers, while the complex preparation process gave communities shared projects that brought them together around common goals. Different regions developed signature fermentation styles based on local ingredients and climate conditions. Areas with abundant dates produced beverages with rich, molasses-like characteristics. Regions where grapes grew wild created drinks with wine-like qualities, but much more complex flavor profiles. The variety was endless, with each community proud of their unique contributions to Egyptian beverage culture. Now let's talk about something that demonstrates the incredible sophistication ancient Egyptians brought to food preservation technology. Vacuum-sealed clay vessels that removed air from food containers using techniques that wouldn't look out of place in modern food science laboratories. Except they accomplished it all with materials and methods available 4,000 years ago. The process began with selecting clay vessels that had been specifically designed for airtight storage. These weren't ordinary pottery pieces. They were engineered containers with precisely fitted lids and sealing systems that could create nearly perfect air barriers when properly assembled. The clay compositions were formulated to be non-porous, while maintaining enough flexibility to prevent cracking under pressure changes. The sealing technique was ingenious. Hot wax mixed with tree resins would be applied to lid joints while the vessels were still warm from food preparation. As everything cooled, the wax created hermetic seals that prevented air exchange. Some advanced techniques involved creating partial vacuums by heating air inside the sealed containers, then allowing them to cool, which drew the lids down tight and removed oxygen that could spoil stored foods. The foods that went into these vacuum-sealed vessels were specifically prepared for long-term storage. Concentrated fruit pastes, dried meat preparations, seasoned grain mixtures, and other treats that would benefit from oxygen-free environments. The absence of air prevented oxidation, mold growth, and insect infestation that could destroy months of careful preparation work. Opening these sealed vessels was almost ceremonial. The wax seals had to be carefully removed to avoid contamination, and the first rush of preserved aromas when the containers were opened could be intoxicating. Foods that had been stored for months would emerge with flavors that had concentrated and developed in ways impossible with normal storage methods. The technology was so effective that archaeologists have found sealed vessels in tombs with food contents still recognizable after thousands of years. While nobody would want to eat them now, the preservation quality demonstrates just how advanced Egyptian food storage techniques had become. These vacuum-sealed containers became valuable trade goods in their own right. The technology required specialized knowledge and materials that weren't available everywhere, so regions that mastered the techniques could trade preserved foods over long distances, opening up economic opportunities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. But ancient Egyptians weren't content to focus only on preservation technology. They also developed what might be the world's first flavored waters, created by infusing plain water with fruits, herbs, and spices to create refreshing beverages that provided hydration along with genuine nutritional benefits and complex taste experiences. The infusion process was more sophisticated than just dropping ingredients into water and waiting. Different materials required different extraction techniques to maximize their contributions, while avoiding bitter or unpleasant compounds that could ruin the finished beverages. Fruits might be crushed to release juices, while herbs were often bruised to break cell walls that contained aromatic oils. Temperature control was critical because different compounds extracted best at different heat levels. Some ingredients released their best flavors in cold water over long periods. Others needed brief exposure to hot water to extract quickly before cooling for consumption. Master infusion makers developed techniques that combined multiple extraction methods in single batches. The timing was equally important. Over-extraction could create bitter or overwhelming flavors that masked the subtle characteristics that made flavored waters appealing. Under-extraction produced weak beverages that provided little benefit over plain water. The skill lay in knowing exactly when each ingredient had contributed its optimal amount to the mixture. The finished flavored waters were revelations for people accustomed to drinking plain water, beer, or fermented beverages as their only options. Mint-infused waters provided cooling sensations that were especially prized during hot weather. Fruit-infused waters delivered vitamins and natural sugars that provided gentle energy boosts. Herb-infused waters offered medicinal benefits disguised as pleasant beverages. Children particularly loved these flavored waters because they made hydration enjoyable rather than just necessary. Parents appreciated that they could ensure their children drank enough fluids while providing additional nutrition in forms that didn't require coercion or bribery. The social aspects were significant too. Offering flavored water to guests demonstrated hospitality and sophistication. Different flavor combinations became signatures of different households, with recipes closely guarded and passed down through generations as family treasures. Speaking of innovation, let's explore something that showcases Egyptian creativity at its most ambitious. Multi-stage fermented foods that underwent several different fermentation processes in sequence, each adding new flavors and characteristics while building on the results of previous stages. These weren't just preserved foods. They were flavor development systems that created tastes impossible to achieve through any other means. The process typically started with basic fermentation of fruits or grains, using wild yeast to create alcoholic bases with complex flavor foundations. But instead of stopping there, Egyptian fermentation masters would introduce different microorganisms at specific stages to continue developing the foods in new directions. Secondary fermentations might involve different bacterial cultures that produced acids, creating sour notes that balance the sweetness from initial fermentation. Some foods underwent third-stage fermentations, with specialized organisms that created entirely new flavor compounds while preserving and concentrating the results of earlier processes. The timing between stages was absolutely critical. Each fermentation had to be allowed to proceed to exactly the right point before the next stage could begin successfully. Too early, and the food wouldn't have developed sufficient complexity. Too late, and over-fermentation would create off flavors that could ruin months of careful work. The environmental control required for successful multi-stage fermentation was remarkable for its time. Temperature, humidity, and air exposure had to be managed precisely at each stage, with different requirements for different phases of the process. Egyptian fermentation masters developed techniques for creating controlled environments using only natural materials and careful observation. The finished products were unlike anything else in their food culture. They had layers of flavor that revealed themselves over time as you ate them. Initial tastes might be followed by completely different flavors as fermentation products interacted with your saliva and taste buds. Some batches continued changing flavor even as you chewed them, creating eating experiences that seemed almost magical. These multi-stage fermented foods became the most prized treats in Egyptian culture, reserved for only the most important occasions and most honored guests. The time, skill, and resources required to create them meant they represented the pinnacle of culinary achievement, expressions of mastery that few could attempt and even fewer could execute successfully. Now here's something that demonstrates the incredible attention to detail ancient Egyptians brought to even simple snack preparation. Individually wrapped treats that were enclosed in specially prepared leaves or cloth covers that not only preserved freshness, but also added their own subtle flavors and aromatic qualities to the foods they protected. The wrapping materials were chosen as carefully as the foods themselves. Different leaves provided different preservation qualities and flavor contributions. Some leaves had natural antimicrobial properties that helped prevent spoilage. Others contained aromatic compounds that infused into the wrapped foods, creating subtle flavor enhancements that couldn't be achieved any other way. The preparation of wrapping materials was almost as complex as preparing the foods they would contain. Leaves might be treated with salt solutions to enhance their preservation the more pliable while active qualities. Some were briefly heated to make eating aromatic compounds. Others were aged under controlled conditions to develop optimal characteristics for specific applications. The wrapping techniques themselves were specialized skills passed down through families and professional guilds. Different foods required different wrapping approaches to ensure proper preservation, while allowing controlled flavor exchange between wrapper and contents. The goal was perfect protection that enhanced rather than masked the natural characteristics of the wrapped treats. Opening these individually wrapped treats became ritual experiences that added to their appeal. The anticipation of unwrapping, the release of preserved aromas, the revelation of perfectly preserved foods that had been protected and enhanced by their coverings. Each wrapped treat was like a small gift, even when you had prepared it yourself. The portability advantages were enormous for a culture that often traveled long distances for trade, work, or religious purposes. Individually wrapped treats could be carried safely in pouches or baskets without contaminating each other. They provided portion control and prevented waste that might occur with bulk storage methods. Different wrapping styles became associated with different occasions and social contexts. Everyday treats might be wrapped simply for basic protection. Special occasion treats could be wrapped with decorative techniques that made the presentation as important as the contents. Gift treats were wrapped with extra care that demonstrated respect for the recipient. But let's dive into something that shows just how far ancient Egyptian food technology had advanced. Temperature-controlled fermentation chambers that maintained specific environmental conditions for optimal food development, using only natural materials and ingenious engineering that rivals modern controlled environment systems. These fermentation chambers were typically underground or built into hillsides to take advantage of natural temperature stability. The construction involved multiple layers of different materials that provided insulation, moisture control, and temperature regulation through passive solar heating and natural convection systems. The temperature control was achieved through careful positioning relative to sun exposure, strategic ventilation openings that could be adjusted for seasonal conditions, and thermal mass systems that stored and released heat to maintain consistent environments. Different chambers were optimized for different temperature ranges depending on their intended fermentation applications. Humidity control was equally sophisticated, using combinations of water features, ventilation systems, and hygroscopic materials that absorbed or released moisture as needed to maintain optimal conditions. Some chambers included systems for introducing controlled amounts of steam or dry air depending on the requirements of specific fermentation processes. The monitoring systems were based on careful observation of indicator organisms, visual cues, and environmental changes that signaled when adjustments were needed. Egyptian fermentation masters developed almost scientific approaches to reading these signs and making precise adjustments that maintained optimal conditions throughout extended fermentation periods. These controlled environment chambers allowed Egyptian food producers to create consistent, high-quality fermented products, regardless of seasonal weather variations or other environmental challenges. The technology represented a level of sophistication that wouldn't be seen again in many parts of the world for thousands of years. The chambers also enabled experimentation with fermentation techniques that wouldn't have been possible under uncontrolled conditions. Egyptian food innovators could try new approaches, test different ingredient combinations, and develop entirely new categories of fermented treats that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. Finally, let's talk about something that brings together all the themes we've explored about ancient Egyptian snack culture. Seasonal treat calendars that coordinated the production and consumption of different snacks with agricultural cycles, religious observances, and social activities to create year-round programs of food-based celebration and community building. These calendars weren't just lists of what to eat when. They were sophisticated systems that maximized the use of seasonal ingredients while creating anticipation and variety that made each part of the year special in its own way. Different months featured different signature treats that people looked forward to and associated with specific times and activities. The agricultural coordination was essential because it ensured that ingredients were used at peak quality while preventing waste during abundant harvest periods. Fruits that ripened in specific seasons were immediately transformed into preserved treats that could be enjoyed throughout the year. Grains were processed into different types of snacks depending on their optimal harvest timing. Religious observances were integrated into the treat calendars in ways that made food an integral part of spiritual practice. Different gods and goddesses had associated treats that were prepared during their festival seasons. Religious fasting periods were followed by celebration periods featuring special foods that marked the return to normal eating patterns. Social activities were coordinated with treat production in ways that strengthened community bonds while distributing the workload of complex food preparation. Different families might specialize in different seasonal treats, trading their specialties with neighbors to ensure everyone had access to variety throughout the year. The anticipation created by seasonal treat calendars was an important part of their social function. People looked forward to specific times of year, not just for religious or agricultural reasons, but because they knew certain beloved treats would become available. This created shared excitement that brought communities together around common experiences. The preservation and storage systems required to support seasonal treat calendars were incredibly sophisticated, involving multiple preservation techniques, storage facilities, and distribution networks that ensured treats remained available and high quality throughout their intended seasons. The logistics alone represented major organizational achievements. These seasonal calendars also served educational functions, teaching children about agricultural cycles, religious traditions, and community cooperation through the treats associated with different times of year. Food became a vehicle for cultural transmission that ensured important knowledge and values were passed to new generations. The flexibility built into these systems allowed for adaptation to unusual circumstances, like crop failures, extreme weather, or social disruptions. Alternative treats could be substituted when primary ingredients weren't available, ensuring that the social and cultural functions continued even when specific foods weren't obtainable. What's most remarkable about these ancient Egyptian snack innovations is how they integrated pleasure, nutrition, preservation, social bonding, cultural expression, and practical problem-solving into unified systems that served multiple purposes simultaneously. They understood that food could be far more than sustenance, recognizing its potential as art, medicine, social glue, and cultural vehicle. Their techniques for manipulating flavors, textures, and preservation represent sophisticated food science achieved through careful observation and generations of accumulated knowledge. Modern food technologists continue studying these ancient approaches, often rediscovering principles that industrial food production has overlooked or abandoned in favor of efficiency over quality. The social dimensions of Egyptian treat culture remind us that eating has always been fundamentally communal, with snacks serving as bridges between individuals, families, and communities. Their understanding that food should bring people together, create shared experiences, and strengthen social bonds remains as relevant today as it was 4,000 years ago. But perhaps most importantly, these ancient Egyptian snack makers understood something that modern food culture sometimes forgets. Treats weren't just about immediate gratification or empty indulgence. They were investments in relationships, expressions of creativity, celebrations of abundance, and connections to the divine. Every honey cake shared with a neighbor, every pickled vegetable passed around a work crew, every fermented beverage enjoyed at a gathering represented an acknowledgement that life should contain moments of sweetness, complexity, and joy, even in the harshest circumstances. Their legacy lives on not just in specific techniques or recipes, but in the understanding that food can be a vehicle for human connection, cultural expression, and genuine pleasure that enriches life far beyond mere survival. The next time you enjoy a snack, remember that you're participating in a tradition that stretches back thousands of years, connecting you to countless generations of people who understood that eating should be one of life's great pleasures. In the grand scheme of ancient Egyptian snacking, there was one category of treats that stood above all others in terms of sheer audacity and engineering prowess: frozen desserts. Now, before you start imagining ice cream trucks rolling through the desert, let me paint you the real picture. These weren't your modern frozen treats, but they were genuine attempts to create cold, refreshing snacks in one of the hottest climates on Earth. The logistics alone were mind-boggling. Wealthy Egyptians would organize expeditions to distant mountains, sometimes hundreds of miles away, specifically to harvest snow and ice. Teams of runners would transport this precious frozen cargo in specially designed insulated containers, racing against the merciless desert sun. Most of the ice would melt during transport, but what survived the journey was literally worth its weight in gold. The containers themselves were marvels of ancient engineering. Multiple layers of different insulating materials, each chosen for specific thermal properties. Thick felt made from animal hair provided the outer shell. Clay vessels with narrow necks minimized air exposure. And the innermost containers were often made from polished metal that reflected heat while conducting cold efficiently. But here's where it gets really interesting. Egyptian frozen dessert makers didn't just pack snow into bowls and call it a day. They created complex layered compositions that told stories through temperature, texture, and flavor. The base might be packed snow mixed with fruit juices that had been concentrated through boiling until they were intensely sweet and flavorful. Middle layers could feature different fruit combinations, each chosen for how their flavors would develop as they slowly melted on the tongue. Date syrup created amber-colored layers with molasses-like richness. Fig pastes provided purple streaks with complex sweetness. When available, imported honey created golden veins that added floral notes to the frozen composition. The serving ritual was as elaborate as the preparation. Special bowls made from precious metals or carved stone were pre-chilled using whatever ice was available. Guests would be presented with small ivory spoons and instructed on the proper technique for eating frozen desserts without shocking their systems too severely. The eating experience was unlike anything else in Egyptian cuisine. The initial shock of cold against your palate, followed by the slow revelation of concentrated flavors as the frozen mixture melted. Each spoonful was different as various layers combined in your mouth, creating flavor combinations that change throughout the eating process. Children who were lucky enough to experience these frozen treats often described them in terms that sounded almost mystical. The sensation of eating winter in the middle of summer, of tasting concentrated fruit flavors that seemed more intense than anything fresh could provide. Parents used access to frozen treats as ultimate rewards for exceptional behavior or achievements. But frozen desserts weren't just novelty items for the ultra-wealthy. Resourceful Egyptian cooks developed techniques for creating frozen-style treats using more accessible methods. During the brief winter months when nighttime temperatures occasionally dropped near freezing, they would create shallow clay dishes filled with fruit mixtures and leave them outside during the coldest hours. The results weren't true frozen desserts, but they were slushy, partially frozen treats that provided blessed relief from heat while delivering concentrated fruit flavors that were impossible to achieve any other way. These makeshift frozen treats became seasonal celebrations, with entire communities gathering before dawn to harvest their overnight creations before the sun melted them completely. Even more ingenious were the underground cooling chambers that some wealthy families constructed. These were deep pits lined with insulating materials and designed to maintain temperatures that were significantly lower than surface conditions. While they couldn't create truly frozen desserts, they could preserve partially frozen treats for extended periods. The social status associated with serving frozen treats was enormous. It demonstrated not just wealth, but organizational ability, forward planning, and connections to trade networks that could supply exotic ingredients and transportation systems. A host who could present frozen desserts to guests was making a statement about their position in society that couldn't be ignored. But let's shift focus to something equally impressive, but more accessible to ordinary Egyptians. Crystallized tree saps that were essentially ancient hard candy, created by collecting resins from specific trees and processing them into clear, jewel-like confections that dissolved slowly in your mouth while releasing complex flavors that seemed to capture the essence of entire forests. The sap collection process was almost ritualistic. Certain trees were known to produce particularly flavorful resins, and Egyptian candy makers would make seasonal journeys to harvest these precious materials at exactly the right times. The trees had to be scored carefully to encourage sap flow without damaging them permanently. Different trees produced saps with completely different characteristics. Some created clear, almost colorless resins that had subtle pine-like flavors. Others produced amber-colored saps with rich, complex tastes that seemed to contain hints of flowers, earth, and sunshine all combined. The most prized saps came from trees that grew in specific locations with unique soil conditions. The processing technique was where real skill became apparent. Raw tree sap contained impurities, water, and compounds that could create off flavors if not removed properly. Egyptian candy makers developed filtration and purification methods that removed unwanted elements while concentrating the desirable flavor compounds. The crystallization process required precise temperature control and timing that seems almost scientific by modern standards. The purified sap was heated slowly until it reached specific consistency levels, then cooled under controlled conditions that encouraged the formation of clear, hard crystals rather than cloudy, soft masses. Different cooling techniques produced different crystal structures and textures. Slow cooling created large, clear crystals that dissolved gradually and provided long-lasting flavor experiences. Rapid cooling produced smaller crystals with different dissolution characteristics that delivered flavor bursts more quickly. The finished crystallized saps were genuinely beautiful, resembling precious stones more than candy. They were often shaped into small geometric forms or left as natural crystal formations that captured and reflected light in ways that made them seem almost magical. The flavor experiences were unlike anything else in Egyptian cuisine. Each piece dissolved slowly, releasing layers of complex tastes that seemed to evolve as the crystal structure broke down in your mouth. Some varieties provided warming sensations, others created cooling effects, and a few seemed to stimulate different taste sensations in sequence. Children were fascinated by these crystallized saps, not just for their flavors, but for their jewel-like appearance and the way they seemed to last forever if sucked slowly rather than crunched between teeth. Parents appreciated that the slow dissolution meant a single piece could provide extended entertainment and flavor satisfaction. The medicinal applications were significant too. Different tree saps were believed to provide different health benefits, from soothing sore throats to improving digestion. The concentrated format made it easy to consume therapeutic amounts of beneficial compounds while enjoying genuine treat experiences. Now let's explore something that demonstrates the incredible sophistication ancient Egyptians brought to texture manipulation. Aerated grain foams that were created by introducing air into cooked grain mixtures through mechanical whipping techniques that produced light, fluffy confections with textures that seemed almost impossible given their simple ingredients. The grain preparation process was critical because different grains responded differently to aeration techniques. Some grains needed to be cooked until they were completely soft and could be mashed smooth. Others worked better when they retained some texture that would provide structure to the finished foam. The whipping technique was where real skill became apparent. Egyptian foam makers developed tools and methods for incorporating air into grain mixtures without destroying their structure or creating unstable foams that would collapse quickly. The timing, speed, and duration of whipping all had to be precisely controlled. So there you have it, the wild, wonderful, and sometimes questionably edible world of ancient Egyptian junk food. From honey bombs that could glue your jaw shut to fermented grain beverages that were basically ancient energy drinks, these desert dwellers had figured out indulgence thousands of years before we invented the convenience store. They turned simple ingredients into complex pleasures, transformed survival foods into social experiences, and proved that the human desire for something sweet, crunchy, or deliciously unnecessary transcends time itself. The next time you're reaching for that bag of chips or candy bar, remember you're participating in a tradition that stretches back to the banks of the Nile, where people understood that life's too short not to enjoy what you eat.